My name is Megan Dayton. I'm a senior demographer at the Minnesota State Demographic Center. We are housed in the Department of Administration in the Community Services branch, and we do a lot of the same work that you've heard from the Census Bureau and from Rodolfo at HACER. So there will be some repeating slides up here, but I have a very, I think, important message that ties all of this together that I hope to share with you this morning. So I'd like to start with the national growth rate for Minnesota. We grew at about 7.6% over the last 10 years, 2010 to 2020. And that was right on par with the national average at about 7.6%. So we had a really positive growth rate here in Minnesota, especially when compared to the Midwest surrounding us in the northeastern states, right? Lots of people are moving to the south and the western states in the country. So we have very preliminary data from the Census Bureau so far, broad age groups and broad race groups. So we can't tell a lot of what's happening right now, but what we can see very clearly is that all of the growth over the last 10 years came from people who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The white non-Hispanic population declined for the first time ever between 2010 and 2020 by 51,000 people. So if we had relied on the growth rate of white non-Hispanic people, as we have done for decades before, we would be declining at this point, right? There's some other issues with the data here with the multicultural population. We know very clearly, especially with the Hispanic population and the decennial census, the way that people are able to characterize themselves in the decennial census is very problematic. So sometimes there's shifts between the broad race groups just based on the way people are able to self-identify, right? So the multicultural group here, 2 or more races at the bottom, exponential growth, but what we don't know if that's a choice in the way people are choosing to self-identify or if that is actual exponential growth in the multicultural group. Really important nonetheless. So here's another way that that's represented. We are still an overwhelmingly non-Hispanic white state, but they won't stay that way for long, right? We see large populations in the Black African American population, almost 7%, and then Hispanic is about 6.1% in Minnesota. So just overall population growth. I just want to highlight this really quickly because growth is still concentrated in the 7-county metro in Minnesota. But down here in the southwestern corner of the state, that blue county that's sitting all by itself is Nobles County, which is 20%, 25% now Hispanic. There's a very large agricultural community in Nobles County. Rodolfo was talking about birth rates for the Hispanic population in Minnesota. It's so much higher. And so places where the Hispanic population is concentrated are growing much more rapidly than anywhere else in the state. So you saw this slide earlier. You saw these data earlier. I don't know why it's populating all of them. Something happened in the transfer over here. But what this is really showing is that since 1990, there has been incredible growth in the population of folks who identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color, and particularly for the Black, Hispanic, and Asian population. What I was talking about earlier, you see in 1980, it's a little hard to see, but the Hispanic population in 1980 just sort of pops up out of nowhere. We all know that that didn't happen that way. It's just the way that people are able to identify themselves in the decennial census, and that is problematic, right? The same thing happened for the other race category in 2000. Those folks just popped up out of nowhere, which is not what happened. Hopefully in 2030, when we see the Middle Eastern or North African broad race group added to the decennial census, we'll see that happen again. Whoa. Okay, well, good thing Rodolfo had this because you already saw it, right? What he forgot to mention is that there's this Scandinavian ski jump that happens at the turn of the century here, where we go from really 3 primary sending countries in Minnesota of Germany, Norway, and Sweden to a bottoming out of those sending countries, but an absolute explosion in the number of sending countries into Minnesota. And now at the top of the list is Mexico. Mexican-born Minnesotans are the highest population of foreign-born folks in Minnesota, about 66,000. So here's what I really want to drive home. This is that population pyramid that you've seen before in the previous 2 presentations. We have our babies on the bottom, 0 to 4, and every line going up is 5 years of age to our oldest Minnesotans at 85 plus at the top. The blue portion of the bar is folks who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color, and then the green portion of the bar is white non-Hispanic. So about 5% of our oldest Minnesotans identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. That's not very much, but you can see that the blue portion of the bar gets bigger and bigger every time you take a step down, right? To our babies, down at the bottom, 1 in 3 babies born today in the state of Minnesota is born to a mother who identifies as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. And we know that the parent population, well, let me say that the other way. We know that the child population will continue to get more and more diverse every year because the parent population gets more and more diverse every year. So there's this momentum to diversity that's built into our age structure. No matter what happens at our borders, our state borders, our national borders, no matter what happens, we will continue to get more and more diverse. So I posted this on LinkedIn the other day, and it seemed to get a lot of traction. There was an article in the Sayhan Journal. If you're not familiar, I encourage you to go check it out because it's a really great news source for the international community in Minnesota. So this represents international migration into Minnesota. It's the balance of into and out, but it's always positive. We always have more people moving into Minnesota from international locations than we have Minnesotans moving away for international locations. It's always positive, right? But what this doesn't show you is that this is what's driving the workforce in Minnesota. This is what has been driving the workforce in Minnesota for 20 years. And in particular, in Minnesota, because of the agricultural community that we have in greater Minnesota that particularly relies on the Hispanic community here in Minnesota. So really strong growth for international migration, both in 2002, 2017, and all the years in between. We had hoped that it would stay as positive as it was in 2017. Changes to federal immigration policy impacted the number of people who were moving here to Minnesota as well. So here's domestic migration. This is people moving from other states into Minnesota, and it's been negative for a very long time, all throughout the 2000s. So this just really drives home that international immigration is driving the workforce in Minnesota. Again, we were positive for 2 years there in 2017 and 2018, and we hoped, I don't know if you could hear us demographers around the country cheering, well, the state cheering that this was positive again, but we were, but it didn't stay that way, so we dropped down to about 0 in 2019. So here's that labor force, right? If you look back this slide, in the 1990s, every single year is positive, right? And that's what led here to the 54,000 additional workers to our labor force every single year over the course of the 1990s. That is incredible. We will never see that again. And it's dropped about in half in 2010 to 2015, and even more significantly into 2020 and 2025, where we are right now, about 6,000 additional people added to our labor force here in Minnesota. And those numbers out into the future are the projections, and they are entirely reliant on international immigration in Minnesota. And so here is the culmination of what I hope I've been telling you this morning, is that all of the population and economic growth in Minnesota has been and will continue to be driven by Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the state of Minnesota. So our labor force continues to grow, but it is only because of the diverse community that we have here in Minnesota. So these numbers here in 2010, you see strong growth overall to the entire portion of the bar, but decline in the blue portion of the bar, which is white non-Hispanic workers in the state of Minnesota. So as we start to talk about, as demographers, we talk about median household income or other economic indicators that show levels of economic security and stability in the state. We like to talk about Minnesota as a really great place to live and a really great place to be, but we need to focus on populations that identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color to help bring them up, or this state will not continue to be the great state that we like to think that it is. So that's what I hope to leave you with here today. My contact information is there. I went through this really quickly with the 10 minutes that I had. I'd love to have more time with you, so if you have questions, if you want to talk about this anymore, please feel free to follow up. Thank you.